Hi guys. I had this great idea. Have you guys seen Prezi, the presentation software? You zoom around a PNG image. There's an open source version. And I had it all set up. I finally got my good idea, but I didn't have quite the time to make it work. So I will just show you the metaphor in itself. There it is. Okay. Okay, so first of all, my name is Ambjorn Elder. I am a master's student for international affairs at the American University of Paris. I'm a former actor. Until 3 years ago, I was an actor living in London. And I got really interested in free and open source software. I needed something else to do. I went and got a political degree, or I'm getting a political degree, and I'm doing my thesis, which is about more or less what I'm going to be talking to you about today, which is politics. And I've talked to a lot of you guys now, and I know that politics doesn't have quite as bad a name here as it does places that I've seen online. But everywhere, politics has a bad name. And so I'm going to be focusing, with all of this, is about politics as a problem-solving strategy, rather than about ideology, rather than about... there are principles involved, there's a principal argument to be made, but this is about getting things done. So I'm going to be talking about how the actions of governments can make our lives difficult as free and open source partisans, as people who use it, not because governments are evil, but because governments do this, and how we might be able to better make sure that they don't make our lives difficult. Make coding easier in the future, make the internet freer in the future, safer, more open, all of this kind of stuff. Methodology. It's about grassroots politics. It's about getting all Greenpeace on their asses. Using well-tested political techniques. This is stuff that's worked for other people in the past. This is all, I'm still applying, I'm still figuring out how it all works, but we'll go into it a little bit. And how to do it right. Right. So I'm not a visually oriented person, but I was trying to come up with a metaphor that wasn't too corny, and I thought that a function would sort of talk about what I'm talking about. Again, the idea is we zoom in on specific bits, but this is my function. So how to make the future safe for everybody, and I'll go through it a little bit. It's a pretty simple function. I'm not a coder. It's sort of Lua with a little bit of other stuff. It's pseudocode. Apologies to any people who really know what they're doing here. Right. So, start with some of our assumptions. Simon Phipps, the other day in the lecture, he mentioned this great idea that code is law. This is something, there was a chapter in a book by Lawrence Lessig. He took it from a guy named Joel Reidenberg, who published in the Texas Law Review Journal. It's a great idea because technology does have an effect like law on the way we live our lives. But it doesn't apply to everything, and these guys don't think it applies to everything either. Code isn't the only law. There are other laws too. There are laws that modify code, just like there's international law that modifies local law, or local law that makes international law irrelevant. So when we're talking about the law of code on the internet, we have to also keep in mind that that code law can be superseded by getting thrown in jail by your local authority. And that other people write code too. That industry writes DRM. They find streaming solutions that make, for instance, the peer-to-peer sharing difficult or irrelevant to them, right? So there are all sorts of, right, the cloud, we talked about problems in the cloud. All of these are solutions that against the threats posed by freedom to these organizations. That's getting a little ideological there. Was that point clear? More or less. Okay. And then, of course, governments also pass laws. They arrest people. The enforcement and the issuance of laws are a big concern of ours. And they should be. They should be a big concern of ours. Because technology can't solve every problem. And in the environment for free software, there are points of control. the internet is more or less a privately run structure. And we're seeing now governments and industry working, ISPs working on using those points of control to get a sense of what people are doing online and eliminate the things they don't like. Sometimes includes things that need to be eliminated, sometimes doesn't. That's a discussion that you can have. But you notice that there are these points of control. Okay. What's my next assumption? Right, that law matters. So, if it's not true that code can do everything, that we don't need anything else, if it's true that law matters, and if it's true that my problems are your problems, that everyone here in this room, we have common interests as advocates, as users, as coders, as a community, then we need to think about this function, how we use political influence to get what we need. Right. Where am I now? Sorry? Yes, the idea was I was going to zoom in and out at different points. It wasn't going to be totally linear. Code is law. Law has an effect. Community share interest. Right. So, how do we affect policy? We have a bunch of things that we try at the moment. And Simon Phipps went into some of this stuff the other day about protesting, about we do a lot of discussion, we do a lot of principled discussion, ideas, refining our ideas, making sure that our ideas are consistent, that they're realized in what we do. So we use our existing community advocacy tools to try to focus our community. We try and combat community apathy, and we try to sort of bring people who are hobbyists. This is sort of the job of advocacy. We try to bring people hobbyists and activate them and make them part of the community. But this stuff isn't totally working. We're not getting it done. And this is where we fall into the error. We say freedom rocks. We have a great discourse, but we're not getting it done. And let me give you an example. Oh, there's a really good example. The Sind law, recently down in Spain. It was last year. It was legislation that was first tried last year. It was some version of the three strikes. It was another one of these ISP control systems. And there was a big mobilization. And I can't remember what the Spanish organization is called right now. No, I can't do it. But anyway, they reached out and they contacted the EFF. They used WikiLeaks. They used a leak from WikiLeaks because it came out that the United States Trade Authority had actually written, almost word for word, the text that ended up being presented and discussed by the Spanish Parliament. So they went through this whole thing, and they did a really great political campaign, and they defeated the law. The law was not passed, the session ended, and this was a huge success. And then, the next session, one of the first things they did, they brought the law back, and it passed. First go, almost no stink. So, lack of focus, lack of resources, as Simon Phipps was saying the other day, meant that the job was half done, which meant it wasn't done at all. ACTA, which is going to be the focus of my thesis, is another example where some really great advocacy happened, but there didn't exist the weight, the political weight, to really change some of the things that needed to be changed. And this means that, really quite extraordinarily, we have, if not for the first time, for almost the first time, international law. This is a body, the beginning of a growing body of international law of intellectual property. International law has traditionally been, over the last 60 years, 70 years of international law, the basis of international law has been horrible crimes, physical crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, mass rape and murder. and there is a body of common law, but it's quite a new thing that ACTA is working towards a criminal international common law of intellectual property. It's I'll explain another time exactly how that's happening. It's strange, it's surprising, and it's going to go from ACTA to the next treaty, which is there's a Pacific. The name is escaping me. There's a Pacific area trade treaty that the United States is going to join, and one of the preconditions for joining is going to be ACTA-like provisions in the treaty. And we can't fight it because we're not at the table. But there are methods that work. There have been, for about 150 years, a growing body of strategies whereby a principled group of people who believe the same thing, who have the same idea of causality, what makes one thing happen, what makes the world better, and share common goals and common dreams, how these people, although we have no power on our own, and sometimes very powerless, sometimes these are people, women in South America whose husbands have been taken away. They're poor women, they don't have any political resources, but there are techniques for these people that have grown up in the past, especially in the past 30 or 40 or 50 years, where they can work with other people to achieve objectives globally. And there are a number of different ways of talking about this. How am I doing for time? I'm not doing too badly. Good, because I'd like some pushback at the end. The way I prefer is international advocacy network. So, or transnational advocacy network. Transnational means there are people inside of national borders who talk with each other, who work together. Not necessarily governments, although governments can be a part of, or portions of governments can be a part of these things too. Portions of industry can be a part of these things. Academia, it doesn't really matter what your association is. It matters whether you have the same values, have the same causal ideas, that in two ways, both that working together in a certain way can make something happen, and that the effect, if you get what you want, we all believe that free software promoted improves knowledge, education, all this kind of stuff, empowers people. On a different, as I said, this isn't going to be too much about principles. So, what are these methods? Some of them, people already do. You need to identify who the decision makers are. And they're not always the people that you think. Simon Phipps, I was talking with him yesterday, and he was talking about how the voting members of Parliament don't actually know anything. And I've heard this from other people who work in Washington. The decisions are made by 20-something, just out of college, people who are way over their heads, but because, just like in the software community, because they're willing to work long hours, because they have the eagerness to learn, enthusiasm, and they're willing to work for little pay, they end up making all of the decisions in these legislative environments. So identifying who's making the decisions and then impacting them. And how do you impact them? Well, the powerless can't directly talk, and of course, talking together, achieve something. But you can also find who your allies are. And it just so happens, for example, in some contexts, the US Department of Defense is actually a huge free and open source software user and producer. And so they have an interest in, now, because they've become a community member, or people inside of it have become a community member, maybe there are I'm not plugged in yet. Maybe there are people there. In industry, obviously, many of us come from industry positions. And so these opinion leaders, these people in positions of influence can say, all right, I'm going to bring a little bit of the pressure to bear that I can through my organization to put pressure on whoever the decision maker is. And we're talking here not about votes, we're talking about policy decisions, when you pass a law or when you decide how to enforce it. So this is the project. In the same way that Niccolo Machiavelli in 1500s in Italy wrote a text saying, all right, you powerful princes, you want to get and maintain power. You want to get what you want. We need a prince, that was the name of his book, The Prince. We need a version of The Prince for free and open source software. And there are other techniques. They're sort of escaping my mind. I didn't write them all down. But let's stop there and see what you guys think of this idea of using the advocacy techniques to better defend our interests as a community. That's it. Hello. Yes?
All I can say is, I mean, anything that's...
Babo, right?
Babu, yes.
Babu,
yeah.
yes.
Anything that's going to help to, you know, if you like, get the way for open software openness in a sense is good. I don't fully understand. I mean, you went into where the actual decision makers are and accessing them. But in terms of the big pictures, why this is happening, any thoughts on that?
Why governments are feeling threatened by?
Yeah, because if you know that, then doesn't that give you the way to tackle it? I mean, I have my own thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is what I was saying before about the transnational nature of our network, from all sorts of different places. And governments represent a sort of the existing power structure in the world. I don't want to sound too Bolshevik here. But governments are how things are organized right now. And so anything that isn't the government that gains power of influence, power of getting things done, is a little bit of a threat, unless it can be brought into the system. So even industry can be a little bit of a threat, and this is more obvious in a place like the places in Africa where some industries set up entire towns, they run schools, they run hospitals, and they're more powerful than the local or even the national governments. And this, and in cases where there are abuses, like in diamond mines, there are entire portions of the Congo, for example, that are totally outside of any kind of law. They're governed by the power of the industry who operates there. So I think that's part of how we pose a threat, just by being a separate power base, in the same way that the environmental, I didn't go into this, environmental lobby is, the women's lobby, how else? What else do you think? I mean, what was your, what were you thinking of?
I was just thinking about it as to, I mean, it's down to, in my opinion, obviously, control, isn't it? Wealth control, whatever it might be.
That's a more succinct way.
Yeah, so it's really a case of, if we understand that, then that's the vested interest. That's why they want to have control of whether it's patents or the 3 strikes below. So in terms of, okay, we want freedom. So why, how can we be a bigger voice?
Right.
And at the moment you're talking about this community here is very small. How do you get the ordinary person to be interested?
Yes, right. Let me put it another way. how can we make our interests align with the decision makers' interests? How can we make our interest in freedom their interest in freedom? I think, this is why I mentioned the Department of Defense, I think the Department of Defense and the interests of the FLOSS community now align somewhat. They're not going to be an enemy. They're not going to be a part of the US government that tries to dampen the activities of the FLOSS or the community or eliminate the internet, and they can wage war over the internet, and so there are all sorts of things that they like about it. And I think we need to do that. I think, for instance, one way, this is a little bit of a silly idea, but one way might be to try and make free and open source software useful to people in elections. Make it pay in some way. Make it easier to get elected by using free and open source software or by leveraging the community. I wonder if there's some way to do that.
I think one of the things that's, sorry.
There was someone in the back there. I haven't met you, sorry.
Just Debbie.
Debbie?
Yeah.
Hi.
One thing I could think about as a problem with open source software is the average age of the person who controls the power.
Yeah.
I mean, would they ever hear about it? I mean, if you look at most of the politicians that we've got, I mean, would they even heard? I mean, you've got the Open Office.
Yeah.
I mean, I just heard about it from word of mouth. I mean, there's no big, I mean, we've got a presence, but maybe it's the younger people, so maybe in like about 40 years' time, then everybody will know about it. I'm not being, but,
That's a long time to wait. There are other movements afoot.
I mean, people are learning about the internet. I mean, I do a volunteer scheme where I'm actually teaching the elderly how to use the internet.
Nice.
But if you think about it, when they turn up, they're like, well, you've got a mouse. Okay, what do I do with it? Do I put it on? I mean, do you put it on the screen and move it around, or do you move it around? And it's just the concept, because it's come so quickly. I mean, it's a very sharp learning curve. So maybe, I don't know, maybe trying to make it a very, one part of it is to make it very, very approachable. So even the people who don't want to try and use a computer can, with the open source, I mean, you've got complete freedom of what we can do with that.
And I wonder if some other parts of some sort of associated things, like open culture, thank you, open culture, specifically open culture, might be more accessible to people. Having access to literature and to music might be something that people understand a little more intuitively, and that might be a way of starting to get to sprit in the advocacy vein, in the ordinary advocacy vein, that I think, obviously there's a lot to improve, but that's fairly well entrained. That might be a strategy.
The internet's pretty amazing, just that people now can access so much more information. So I mean, already people are already expanding their knowledge just because it's so much more accessible now.
Yeah.
So maybe we can look at it like an accessibility kind of.
Yeah. And since you work on the sharp end with older people.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'll volunteer on the sharp end. Maybe you have a better idea. Yeah. I'm sorry, you had a thing as well in the 2 minutes.
It was just an interesting observation for the previous point you made, that the threat seems to be shifting, as you said, the Department of Defence are now pretty much more on board.
I think that's exaggerating, but there's, yeah.
And it's interesting that one of the bigger enemies now has been particularly the creative ends of trade. The real lobbyists now are the big studios, the music companies, those types of people.
And it was just an observation.
Just an observation, there's a shift in threat, yeah.
And the strange thing here is that I think a lot of us think that they're working against their own interests. That really they're just misunderstanding what's going on, and that we would all be better off with. And this is where talking to the right people helps, because there's probably a small handful of people you can try and convince. Listen, just try it this way. We're actually not your enemy. We all want we all want more culture, we all want more movies, we all want more music, preferably good music, but you know. Yes, before I go to the next person, I just want to say there's a survey that I've come with. It's the URL link on this talk in the campfire thingy, and it'd be wonderful if you guys could all fill it out. That's the URL. It's truncated, I think, only a little bit. I think that's just English. Yeah, I'd really appreciate it. So why don't I go with the woman in the back?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking, I'm assuming when you talk about kind of freedom politics and everything, and you say that as the open source community, kind of people who are here and everything, people should stop being on the fringe and being perceived as kind of, oh, these hackers who pirate software, but rather kind of get contacts with people who are, like you say, in government, in companies, who are legitimate.
We're already there, yeah.
Yeah. So kind of link up more with them rather than being perceived as a fringe, semi-illegal activities, but more of a mainstream thing. But then you kind of ended your talk with saying, comparing the tactics with Machiavelli. I don't know if that's the best way to show that you're a well-meaning organisation.
Right, I understand that. Yes, thank you.
You know, that might see, oh, you're being a manipulative so-and-so who wants to backstab his allies.
First, not exactly, yes. I mean,
I know that's not what you mean, but I'm saying if you use analogies like that.
Several versions of the talk, I've been through several versions of the talk, and that probably should have been on the cutting floor. Yes?
I very much like your focus on realpolitik,
yeah.
and finding decision makers who are the actual decision makers. To your point about Machiavelli, I think I very much like the idea of a manual. And as hackers, I think we all like clear set of instructions.
Yeah.
I would suggest The Art of War, Sun Tzu, rather than
nice.
My last point is really about there's a cultural difference between politics and law. Lawyers and politics, they use rhetoric, and the type of discourse that they use is rhetoric, and we're very much logic
absolutely.
Focused. And rhetoric versus logic, I've only been able to argue against philosophers. The only people that
that was my attempt at bridging that gap.
Yes,
rhetoric and logic.
But I think it's worth noting that they're two sides of the same coin, and one can beat the other very, very easily, just sort of judo style.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Picking up on that, I mean, I think one of the things in the art of war is keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
Okay.
And actually, I'm a bit concerned about things like the US Department of Defense.
Sure.
I think we have to be enormously careful about who our fellow travellers are.
Good.
And the fact that they are possibly going in the same direction as us. Make no assumptions. You know, their goals are different, their aims are different.
Absolutely. And I'm. Oh, sorry. Do you want to?
Yeah. And one other point I wanted to make is that I do feel, just because you mentioned ACTA, and we talked a lot at OggCamp last year about the digital economy bill it was at the time, it became the Act subsequently. And I feel that in some senses the focus is shifting slightly, in that ACTA has all the elements of a grand global conspiracy of the powerful, and nobody likes a conspiracy of the powerful.
Yes.
And it's been relatively easy to mobilise against. But
yes.
We're seeing other things now, where particularly, for instance, there's a guy, I can't remember his name, but who was operating a links website in the UK, and the US are trying to extradite him.
Yes.
You know, not the hacker, not the guy who hacked the Pentagon.
Yeah.
It's just operating a website in the UK.
Yeah.
And that attempt to, make US law extraterritorial through the extradition rules, and actually say, well, this is the law in the US, and we're going to bust you for it, and we're going to ship you from England and incarcerate you. You know, that means I think we have to. It's much harder to mobilise for an individual, but it's absolutely important that we, as a community, keep the information flows going, and because unless we defend every single person, whether you agree with his website or not,
yes, sure.
I don't. But unless you defend kind of against every border, there's a danger that we're going to get unravelled from the outside rather than through the big things like ACTA.
Okay. Ooh, there was a lot there.
Sorry.
By the way, we're done, but lunchtime is next, so you're welcome to stay or eat as you want.
Ambjorn?
Yes.
We're also doing a group photograph outside on the grass now for anyone remotely related to Ubuntu using Ubuntu.
Well, thank you so much for coming. If any of you want to stay and continue to vet it out.